All right, good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Yeah. Good. I have to admit that I spent probably a little bit too much time in the Bearcat yesterday, which is usually my whole deal when I'm at residency. If you don't know me, I'd just like to welcome everybody. My name is Jeremy Basso. I'm an HMS student here at Union Institute University. I'm in cohort 15. My background is in communication studies, and over the years I've come into the humanities department and been able to pursue some communication theory and things of that nature through the program here. I'm in my last residency, along with Lawrence as well. So today we're glad to welcome everybody, glad to have everybody for the 17th annual residency conference day. This happens every January for some of those of you who are new. It happens every January, usually about, I would say, October-ish. You might get, for those of you new to the program, you'll get an email that says, call for papers and stuff like that. So for those of you that are new, maybe if you want to do it next time we come, just keep that in mind as well. So today we're going to, one of the presenters actually is a bit under the weather and is most likely probably not going to make it today. So we're going to get to spend all our time with Lawrence.
Careful what you wish for.
And believe me, I spend a lot of time in residency with Lawrence, so I know. Just to give you a little bit of background on Lawrence as an individual. Like I said, he is a member of cohort 15 as well as myself. Lawrence Carr is vice chairperson of the advisory committee of the United Nations Association's Test of English in Japan, alongside distinguished individuals such as the Japanese ambassador to Nepal, Oman, South Africa, Sweden, and Zambia. Mr. Carr serves as chief examiner. He's a joint writer of a journal that I'm going to totally butcher right now because I don't know how to properly pronounce it. Probably. Kokurin. You want to pronounce it?
It's okay.
Kokurin.
I think yours is more entertaining.
That's what I'm here for. Here to entertain everybody. I'm the MC for the day. Kako Mandishu.
Yep.
That's pretty good. First time ever speaking Japanese. Other publications: Developing English Skills, Reporting Current Events and World News. Happiness as a Force for International Equality. Thoughts and Actions Promoting Equality, with considerations from work with the United Nations Association of Japan. It's a journal of international education research. In Canada, Mr. Carr was a legislative assistant to a member of parliament, which we actually spoke about last time when we were eating dinner a little bit. Fundraising consultant to NGOs, including Amnesty International and World Wildlife Fund, and community economic development activist, founding a center that develops the arts as an engine of urban commercial revitalization. He holds a master's in political science, majoring in theory and international relations. So, here is Lawrence Carr, everybody.
With that introduction, most of all, I'm honored that all of you are here. Thank you for coming here early in the morning. And in light of the fact that Greta will not be here for the second part, I've removed my segue remarks to Greta's presentation and will include one additional piece. I'll try to make our short time together as entertaining as possible, on the basis that if I don't enlighten, at least I can try to entertain. What we'll be looking at, and you all have a copy of it, is this photograph. And before we look at the details of the photograph, what I want to do is speak briefly about photography to you, but in a particular context. So what I will do is use the photographic image, which I've called Reflections in the Carousel of Desire, as an entry point to the discussion of Jacques Lacan's basic forms of the roles of desire in a subjective economy. So before examining now three specific sections, there were maybe half a dozen that we could look at. I'm just looking at the three main sections in this. I wanted to consider with you photography from a cultural perspective. Mark Bracker, in Lacan, Discourse, and Social Change, suggests interpolation in its philosophical usage as the process by which cultural beliefs are simply assumed rather than questioned. That this is what sparks the fires of desire to perform the role. So he's saying that desire is an interpolative force. It is causing us at each point to assume that things are as they are, when in fact they may not be. So he contends we must understand the various roles of desire to intervene in the interpellative forces of culture in order to have positive influence on social change. So that is the main basis of it. If we don't understand what is going on, how will we ever have a positive influence in the social change that is necessary to reinscribe, or perhaps not reinscribe, but to challenge and replace or reinvent? So Bracker notes the fact that one originally attains one's desire only by means of the bodily images of another person, and this is in Lacan's conceptualization, means that like the imaginary identification of the mirror stage, imaginary order desire is from the beginning a social and even fictional phenomenon. And this fictional metaphoric nature of desire means that there is no intrinsic, essential, or absolute content to desire in the imaginary order any more than in the symbolic order. And the desire in the imaginary order is produced through the operation of images in cultural artifacts. And so here we see the transition in terms of images in cultural artifacts. Analysis of reflections in the carousel of desire from a Lacanian perspective will explore how the images in this photograph as signifiers act as cultural artifacts and seek to create the self. The purpose of using a photograph, I'm going to pick up one of those, John. The purpose of using a photograph, okay? So I have a longer introduction that we have since compressed, and that may expand somewhat. I had initially wanted to talk about the world through the viewfinder, and how it is that when we look at something through a camera, we already have an interpellative force. We already have something acting which is connected with a sense of perspective, which is a sense that we're looking at everything focused through one point of view, a very Western point of view. If we look at other types of art, types of painting that we won't go into at this stage, we see that there wasn't the world focused only through one point of view. It was more of a wide, if we look at any sort of Eastern tapestry, Eastern paintings, particularly noted in things like the panels that are used in Japanese works of art. The world isn't seen from one perspective. As one walks along, there are many perspectives. I've compressed all of those remarks to the simple question, why use a photograph? And so since you posed that question, a very good question, allow me to respond to that question. And the purpose of using a photograph and analysis of specific elements it contains to discuss particular moments in the economy of desire from a Lacanian perspective, with commentary from other scholars of gender, identity, and Lacan, is to offer a plausible interpretation rather than a plausible interpretation that invites diverse impressions rather than claims to provide absolute definitions. If you look at this and see something different from what I see, something different from what I describe, that's wonderful. And we will return to this. The claim I make isn't that, oh, well, why do you see that in this photograph? Couldn't we see something else? Well, yes, we could, offering plausible explanations. And why this photograph, moving from why a photograph to why this photograph, couldn't I just take any sort of photograph and do that? And the answer in that case is a resounding, yes, you could. And what we will do is look at some of the ways in which I just happen to have done it from this perspective with this photograph. photographic images themselves are both ubiquitous and ambiguous. They are part of our everyday lives. They are also dialogic entities. On one hand, most people regard photographic images as ordinary objects. They're everywhere, we see them all the time. Like surveillance cameras, for example. There's nowhere that you go that you are not being photographed. Right? Constantly, always. And we assume that they simply record their context without analysis or interpretation. On the other hand, this function gives photographic images an authenticity that commentators, notably, for brevity, I'm just looking at Susan Sontag and John Berger in this case, have discussed as tracings off the real. Sontag, in On Photography, comments on the photograph's distinctiveness and its relationship with questions of identity. Sontag says, "No one takes an easel painting to be in any sense co-substantial with its subject. It only represents or refers. But a photograph is not only like its subject, a homage to the subject, it is part of, an extension of that subject, and a potent means of acquiring it, of gaining control over it." This description speaks to the power of the photograph. Sontag also identifies the primacy of photography. She notes, "Images that have virtually unlimited authority in a modern society are mainly photographic images. Such images are indeed able to usurp reality because, first of all, a photograph is not only an image as a painting is an image, an interpretation of the real, it is also a trace. And trace is an important concept for Sontag in terms of what it's doing. And the example she gives, she says, it's an interpretation of the real, something directly stenciled off of the real, like a footprint or a death mask. And a friend of mine in Scotland is doing a piece on death masks because they have had direct contact with the person in whose face contours they are impressed. And so we could have a wonderful painting, to digress for a moment, we could have a wonderful painting of William Shakespeare, but it would not have the resonance with us as, for example, a photograph of William Shakespeare. Impossible, though it may be. If someone said, "This is a photograph," it could be the worst photograph, and we would certainly find that far more compelling than the best painting. Somewhere in between, we have things like the death mask. The significance of that tracing off of the real, performed by photography, also accomplishes a function beyond documentation. It creates a new reality. Sontag notes that photographs do more than redefine the stuff of ordinary experience. People, things, events. Reality as such is redefined. It's presented as an item for exhibition, as a record for scrutiny, as a target for surveillance. Quoting Sontag, "Providing possibilities of control that could not even be dreamed of under the earlier system of recording information," writing. While grounded in the real, the concept of the true, moving from real to true, the concept of the true in photography requires slightly deeper interrogation of how realities, even those like footprints or death masks, come to be, how they operate. Sontag speaks of these kinds of death masks or realities offering possibility of surveillance and control, interrogation. Berger engages in further investigation. He talks about how photographs, it is said, tell the truth. From this simplification, which reduces the truth to the instantaneous, it follows that what a photograph tells about a door or a volcano belongs to the same order of truth as what it tells about a man weeping or a woman's body. if no theoretical distinction has been made between the photograph as scientific evidence and the photograph as a means of communication, this has been not so much an oversight as a proposal. The proposal was, and is, that when something is visible, it is a fact, and that facts contain the only truth. Of course, altering photographs, and we're all familiar with using things like, I guess the most popular one would be Photoshop. And there have been many, many, many others. Since we have time, as a brief digression, we do something different photographically today than people did in the early years of photography. We adopt a particular stance. It changes us immediately. When a camera is brought out, people will stand in what is sometimes termed a reverse gaze position, which is they are looking at the photographer and instructing the photographer as to how they would like to be recorded. Which is to say, immediately people put arms around each other, they will stand together, it's been documented in a friendly, intimate, non-sexual grouping. And that's the way people are photographed. That's the tourist photograph. Typically we see it everywhere all the time. In the early days of photography, I mean, people wouldn't be standing like this. In the early days of photography, people wanted to reenact scenes from famous paintings, and they would stage photographs in that way. Photography was used as an art form, and there was a great debate between artists and photographers as to whether photography was legitimate at all. And so we move to different ways in which photographs have been used and changed. And so, of course, photographs being altered is as old and common as photography itself. But as Berger notes, there's evidence of the perceived, this is evidence. This very alteration is evidence of the perceived authenticity of the photographic image. And the power of faked photographs to deceive derives precisely from the common belief that photographs tell the truth. Berger contends, so that is, the power of the photograph is that we know, has this been photoshopped, has this not been photoshopped? So what I'm finding as a good trend is that now people are beginning more to question the authenticity. So far from seeing alterations and photoshopping as a terrible thing that's being done, I think it is a wonderful thing because people then have to stop and think, is this real or is this fake? And so, and that's a sidebar as we move along. What Berger contends is that in the case of a faked photograph, there's really something different for photography that's going on. And quoting him directly, he says, photographs can be and are massively used to deceive and misinform. And he comments, you can only make a photograph tell an explicit lie by elaborate tampering, collage, and rephotographing. Of course, he wouldn't have talked about Photoshop. What he says here is that at that point, you have ceased to practice photography. You're doing something else with it when you're altering the image in that way. He notes, the camera does not lie even when it is used to quote a lie, and so this makes the lie appear more truthful. This preamble is why the commonplace authenticity of my carousel of desire photograph is relevant. While it was not digitally altered, it was digitally recorded. And this electronic trace also archives its own history in a file referred to as Exchange Information File Format Metadata. So metadata is automatically recorded. It's called EXIF. And if you ever use a digital camera, there is always embedded what is called an EXIF. You can find it, you can see it. And this is the camera's claim that the photograph is authentic. All right? This is like a DNA tag. And this is increasingly being required as a verification security protocol that major news agencies demand for responsible publication of freelance sourced images. And I say this because I have for the past 30 years been a photographer. For the past 13, I have been a professional photographer with my portfolio being curated by Getty Images. They are very conscious of what is and isn't an altered image, and they require backup for things like that. So I just wanted to emphasize that point, that we know when it's fake, we know when it isn't. And part of what we're looking at is what are the theoretical underpinnings of that. More than just what is the picture of, what is the picture doing, what is the rhetoric behind that picture. What is it saying, what is the narrative that it's presenting, and how interesting is it that it presents a narrative and that we never question the narrative that it's presenting. It's there as part of its own ingrained DNA, as part of its own metadata. I say all this to come to the conclusion, or the proposition and claim, my camera only recorded. It's our problem. Okay. That in this photograph, though it's more complex than most images I would take, in this photograph there are no double exposures, there are no post-production tricks. This is exactly as I took the photograph. All right? So the shot was taken into a window, and it shows both the view and the reflection, and it's the file straight out of the camera. So what was happening is I saw the carousel and thought, as many people think, oh, pretty picture. So decided to do that, and noticed that even though I didn't have a flash, I was getting reflection from the spotlessly clean windows in Japan. And I thought, well, this is also interesting. I'm seeing the carousel, and I'm seeing the ladies' clothing store, the women's clothing store, reflected backward in that. If you look at the, I did do one alteration for this, which I will confess to immediately. If you look at the cropped image, which the committee put on the front of your brochure, and then you look at this image, what you will see is that I have reversed the image, so that this is a reflected reflection. All right. I did that so that you could read the signage in English. And okay, otherwise, you'll see it's backward here. So that is the one alteration I did do. I mirror imaged the mirror image, so it brings back to its normal view. All right. And so before we move on, I will say that in all of this, the EXIF metadata makes a simple statement, which is recorded right in it, quote, a directly photographed image. That's exactly what it says. Okay, so now we can move on to a brief description of this, and I'm going to go to another section. So let's read the discourse and rhetoric of elements of this artifact in a section that I will call Master Signifiers, the Goddess of Desire as a Sign of Woman. I'll introduce this with a quote from Bracker, who says that the passive anaclitic form of imaginary desire is exemplified in the phenomenon of fashion. Okay, so, which we can see the phenomenon of fashion is being acted out right here. Okay, so what we're seeing there is an embodiment of the complex concept of passive anaclitic imaginary desire. And let's unpack these technical terms. He says the phenomenon of fashion, which offers corporeal images that subjects can conform with in order to satisfy their desire to be attractive to others. Okay, that's the simple notion of it. Their desire to be attractive to others. That is desired as objects of jouissance by others. And jouissance has three playful, wonderful meanings in French. One meaning is play, jouer au hockey, to play hockey. The other meaning of jouissance is enjoyment of life. French being French, have a third meaning, jouissance as orgasm, which is an intense moment of enjoyment of the pleasure of life, or an intense moment of the enjoyment of pleasure. So it's fun to play with the notion of jouissance. And what do you mean when you were talking about that? But clearly, what you mean in terms of jouissance is always something which you desire in any of its forms. The nucleating point that sparks here is that photographs may be cultural artifacts that present controlling rhetoric. Let's then look at the enlarged portion that you may or may not be able to see, and I'll describe where to look for it on the page. It's the top center third of the carousel of desire. Okay, the top center third. And we see manifested above the carousel, like Venus emerging from the structure of desire to be attractive to others, is a female form idealized as a mannequin. Its height matches the carousel in the complete image. And the action in the complete image radiates out from the figure of the idealized woman and the diminutive figure of the living woman, who is holding a dress exactly like the one the mannequin is modeling, which was just wonderful happenstance. Okay? I mean, since nothing in this photograph was arranged or orchestrated, I didn't position models anywhere in this. This is exactly as it happened. It's what would be termed a grab shot, where you're just taking the scene as it exists. What we see is that bluish longitudinal bands of light, reflections of the canopy of the carousel below, visually draw the woman and the mannequin together. The woman is, however, in an inferior position to the mannequin, smaller in size and almost entirely contained by the reflected bands of light. The mannequin, through the positioning of its hands, seems to be directing the light to envelop the woman. And that worked out rather nicely, without any sense of staging. It just happened to be that way. So let's move to the discussion of interpolation through master signifiers. And in this discussion, Breaker delineates Lacan's registers of subjectivity: symbolic, imaginary, and real. These are the three what are called registers of subjectivity. He specifies that, quote, in culture, these three registers manifest themselves respectively in signifiers, images, and fantasies. Of the three, it is the signifier that holds the key to desire. As Lacan puts it, it is as a derivation of the signifying chain that the channel of desire flows. Bracher notes, passive narcissistic desires of the symbolic order involve a feeling that subjects are loved by the symbolic other because of the signifier they embody, as indicated, for example, in the belief that God loves the meek, in the notion that nature loves the wise and pure, and this is working off of Coleridge, dejection, and in the conviction that society loves a winner. Signifiers one embodies with such identity-bearing words are what Lacan calls master signifiers. In the above detail from Carousel of Desire, we see the woman reaching for the clothing modeled by the symbolic other in the form of the idealization of the cultural notion of female. The woman in the photograph gazes, we look at this, from the dress in her hands toward the model representing the symbolic other. Of course, the woman is not consciously seeking the approval and love of the mannequin as a totem representing the symbolic other. That would be passive narcissistic desire to be the object of the other's love. Yet, the woman regards both the mannequin and the dress it wears with an eye toward emulation, which then becomes active narcissistic desire. So the move from passive to active narcissistic desire is what we see happening. Quoting Bracher, subjects strive to fully actualize the qualities they have identified with while their role as the effect of desire can be seen from the fact that identifications are always motivated. That is, they respond to a want of being. The woman is caught in a net. She is entangled in a web. Okay. Entangled in a web. I've been going too slowly here. We gravitate in active narcissistic desire toward positions and identify with persons, characters, and images linked with one or more of the master signifiers constituting our ego ideal. Seeing this perspective also invites engagement with the underlying narrative. In what I would consider a rejection of the sexist master signifiers and minor ones that importantly support the master signifiers, Bell Hooks correctly advises repudiation of debilitating associations. Says Hooks, feminist ideology should not encourage, as sexism has done, women to believe they are powerless. It should clarify for women the powers they exercise daily and show them ways these powers can be used to resist sexist domination and exploitation. So what we see is that definitions of identity are not fixed. They are artificially imposed and then fixated on the maintenance of a particular style of privilege and domination. In the instant case of women as consumers, Hooks comments, quote, that profit from the sale of women's fashion alone makes it one of the major industries in this economy. Endless purchases of small items can lead to enormous economic power and profit. As consumers, women have this power, and if organized, could use that power to improve women's social status. Now you're saying we should move on from here. Okay, I'm going to skip an entire section and move toward the end. All right. The section that we would look at would be the section in which we see signs and signifiers. And so this particular section we're not going to worry about just now. However, we can return to that perhaps in the discussion later on, because I don't know how many of you are getting listener fatigue at this point, but let me know, throw something, tell me. Okay. And we'll move on to the central, okay, we're coming to the central image of the carousel. And this is going to be the final detail that we have time to examine. So I will take out that part, having been somewhat overly loquacious. What we should note when we look at this, and I'm sorry, it could be a much better image. I recorded it at very high resolution and it degraded along the way. Mirrors are mounted on the carousel's core. The mirrors allow riders to recognize themselves on their favorite animal mannequin, and for mommy or daddy to say, "That's you on the horsey," to their delighted offspring. Okay. And looking at it, there are rows of mirrors on the inside. Breaker notes the urge to have an identity in which one recognizes oneself and is recognized by others results in, quote, the establishment of a cluster of master signifiers as the ego ideal, which originates in the child's attempt to be desired and loved. Right? So that is recognized. And here we are returning to passive narcissistic desire, to be recognized by the other. For children, it is the parent who represents the other. The big other is clearly the parent. Bracker continues that master signifiers provide feelings of coherence and continuity essential to identity and are, as Lacan puts it, what makes a discourse readable. The discourse of the carousel, with animals represented as toys to be safely ridden for enjoyment, communicates a sense of coherence and continuity. On a carousel, the rider moves and the surrounding world remains the same. As a trigger to Hélène Cixous's thoughts in Laugh of the Medusa, we see Medusa heads as decorations between oval mirrors on the carousel's frieze. And that, again, was a very wonderful happenstance. So between the mirrors are Medusa heads. On the inner wall of the carousel, there are only mirrors. On the subject of constantly changing appearances that challenge notions of coherence and continuity, Cixous says, one can no more speak of woman than of man without being trapped within an ideological theater where the proliferation of representations, images, reflections, myths, identifications transform, deform, constantly change everyone's imaginary and invalidate in advance any conceptualization. Cixous' mention of Lacan's imaginary as the register of subjectivity in which images invoke desire further supports the need to break out of the ideological theater, and also leads to her concluding that nothing compels us to deposit our lives into these lack banks. The term lack banks evokes associations with Lacan's third register of subjectivity, the real. What is real is the lack which is stored in these banks. Considering the triple tier of mirrors on the carousel, two girding the inner barrel and another between Medusa heads on the upper frieze, as an attempt to reflect the real world around, the metaphor of the mirror may do double service for references to both Cixous and Lacan. For Cixous, like her metaphor of white ink writing on white paper, the absence that marks the real inscribes it as an absence by providing a ground on which the figure of its absence can be expected and the condition of its never arriving is confirmed. That is, the images in the mirror mirror reality and are not real through the looking glass locations that we may ever actually visit. Lacan couches this in reference to the act of making a photograph and plays with the idea of a photograph or its precursor, a camera, being better understood as a mirror. In Sexuality and the Defiles of the Signifier, Lacan speaks of the way in which the quote, the nodal point by which the pulsation of the unconscious is linked to sexual reality is called desire. Okay? Desire is always a hidden component. Lacan describes, quote, the topology of the subject of certainty, uncertainty in the network of signifiers in relation to sexuality and sexual identity according to a sign which he calls the interior 8. So if we think of an 8 with an upper portion, and he continues, you have only to turn to the obturator, and he's using a French word. Obturator simply means opening. Obturator, I referred to earlier, the enclosed circle of the 8 when viewed three-dimensionally from above, in which sexuality is always contained in the inner core of desire, you'll have only to turn that into a camera shutter. And the exception is that the camera shutter then turns into a mirror. So we're dealing with cameras, camera shutters, and mirrors in Lacan's complex image. I wouldn't have written one so complex. So we're getting to the wrapping up part. It is in the little mirror which shuts out what is on the other side that the subject sees emerge the game to accommodate his own image in what appears. So when we look at the whole world, we are looking at it with an eye to accommodate our own image in it. To move toward our end, Slavoj Žižek writes that while the kernel of the real may be jouissance as enjoyment, there's also the nuance of too much enjoyment. Žižek describes this as a void whereby the real is in itself a hole, a gap, an opening in the middle of the symbolic order. It is the lack around which the symbolic order is structured. Consideration of this lack following surplus invites us to the conclusion of what residual impression we have of carousel of desire. This brings us to our final 3 minutes for some concluding remarks. The entire image is an entity that defines us because it reflects a world that identifies us as we identify ourselves in it. Okay, those last 8 words. identifies us as we identify ourselves in it, is how Lacan's camera as mirror metaphor operates, and reprises the idea of a photograph or its precursor, a camera, being better understood as a mirroring device in a Lacanian sense, that photographs are signifying images. Returning to the teaser copy of this, which is images watch us. We may also add that images speak to us and photographs seek to define us. We are what the photograph says, and it says do this and be this and want this and buy this, and you may be able to be that. So do this in an endless circle, in a carousel of desire in which wanting is the coinage, and in this economy, and goods are the tokens in the game. And the understanding is, to quote a popular Japanese marketing slogan, that nothing is better than the next. It's a situation in which feeling you can have anything you want makes you want everything. In which having everything makes you disappointed in everything. Or put another way, that when you can have or have everything, you are satisfied with nothing. You have everything except satisfaction. Desire keeps the carousel turning. But seeing we are on the carousel is the first task to finding a way off of it. Indeed, the phrase, "Did you get off?" has come to be synonymous with one partner seeking confirmation of another's attainment of the fleeting ecstasy of jouissance. As outlined at the start, the goal of this paper was not to explain the entirety of Lacan's philosophy, system, and his reformulation of Freud in terms of gender and identity as artificial emanations of language and culture. Rather, this analysis of reflections in the carousel of desire from a Lacanian perspective aimed to offer plausible entry points into the functioning of the economy of desire by examining one photograph and referencing selected concepts from Lacan and other writers who have provided cogent interpretation of his work. As Bracher concludes, before I conclude, the value of this taxonomy of desire lies not in its capacity to serve as a totalizing system, but rather in its demonstration of the multifariousness of and complexity of desire, and in its function as a kind of checklist prompting us to search a given text or discourse for interpolative forces that might not be immediately evident, and he asserts that the identification of these forces is a primary means for promoting social change. This paper, last paragraph, last points here. This paper, in examining just one image from the real world, from a Lacanian perspective, presents reflections in the carousel of desire as a synecdoche, and suggests that all photographs must be interrogated rather than internalized. As they seek to define us, we must dialogically undertake to deconstruct and analyze them. Interpolation, in its philosophical usage, as the process by which cultural beliefs are simply assumed rather than questioned, must be interpenetrated, and Dr. Lacan has provided us with the instruments to perform this operation. This paper and our time together this morning has attempted to give us some experience in using them. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions. I really was worried that we weren't going to make the time. But I was worried about it on the other end, not the end that we're at, so it's okay.
Okay, you were worried we wouldn't have enough material.
Yeah.
Okay,
You're good. All right, so if anybody has any questions for Lawrence at all?
I'm just curious, the part that you left out, is there going to be a text version of your talk available anywhere? Because I'd be interested in hearing or reading the section that you didn't have time for.
Well, yeah, thank you. Certainly, there will be, and the part that I left out was the part in which I look at the actual signs, which are paint on wood signs. And there are a couple of things I left it out because it refers to some Japanese cultural expressions that have been reviewed by Japanese thinkers in terms of what does it really mean. So the concept, there are things like love, love, which in our parlance doesn't mean that much, but the phrase, they are not just friends, they are engaged in love, love together, means that they have a romantic sexual relationship. And so a lot of this deals with sections on the meaning of the phallus and how the man pretends to be the phallus, the woman, the man pretends to be the phallus as a signifier of the large O other, and the woman agrees to envelop the phallus as a way of somehow possessing the master signifier of the other. And a lot of, that was part of the section that was left out, and I thought people might be uncomfortable with these references. I didn't. And also, a lot of them are Japanese references in terms of what words mean and the shapes of words. So that was the part I took out for reasons of time. Just the shape. Often you see words in Japan, because this photograph was taken in Tokyo, where I live. You see words in Japan that exist purely because the shape of the letters is pleasing to look at. There are other questions?
Yeah, that part was very interesting to me, because many of these words seem random, like renewal, open, put together, you know. So I'm very intrigued with that aesthetic. And I went to my dad, Lawrence, who's done such a marvelous job of taking very complex material, Berger and Sontag at the time, and so on and so forth, and really trying to arch this one image. So, it's really interesting.
Well, thank you very much. And I would add that my point in all of this finally is that not only can it be done with an image that's complex, but it can be done with the simplest of images. With my students, we were looking at an Arctic expedition in a course that I've designed that's called Current Events, World News, and Visual Analysis. And just looking at how are women photographed, how are men photographed, what is the narrative in this. And though the woman was the leader of the expedition, she was photographed in a way that showed her doing things that were fun and also not being especially attractive. The man was photographed in a way that showed him looking serious. And the underlying narrative was that though this woman is a scientist and the head of the expedition, well, women are just in science for fun, and but men, they're doing the serious work. That was the underlying narrative for the photograph.
I thought was really interesting, even reading the paper, because obviously sent me a paper prior to speaking, was that everything was in English. That was something that was really interesting to me that I didn't recognize right away until I got maybe about halfway, 3/4 of the way through the paper and referenced that too. So that was interesting.
Well, in some of them, just the quick one that you can see that says, life is short, so make your life be full of happiness, is one of the signs. And what it is indicating, there are signifiers there. The way to be full of happiness is to fulfill your desire, that in this case must be to buy the items on display in the shop. And the grim reminder of one's mortality is the rhetorical device used to persuade potential purchasers to spend one signifier, which is money, to attain another, happiness. And then we talk about happiness as an absolute term in Japanese cultural indicator. It's not you are happy, it is you are happiness man, or you are happiness woman. And so these are things that are always noted as idealized conditions rather than transient states. And that's something that clearly there wasn't time to look at that notion of do we ever achieve these, or the notions of demand and desire and the interaction between them. So thank you. I do probably have an extra copy of that.
I'd love to have a copy. So,
Yes.
will you make it available?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to make those available.
All right, well, thank you, Lawrence. That was probably a great way to start off your day, right?
Yeah.
Right? But the next round, you're not gonna get Lawrence for the whole time, so it's probably enjoyable as this one was. Just remember, they might slowly diminish as we go throughout the day.
Yeah.